Okay, friends, I'm Ravikant, and on behalf of all of you and on behalf of CSDS, let's welcome Firat Oruc, with whom I share a lot of interests. And he's an associate professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service in Qatar, and is the editor of Sites of Pluralism, Community Politics in the Middle East, OUP, and Indian Ocean Literary Circularities, which is a special issue of comparative literature. He has also written for a lot of peer-reviewed journals, including the English Language Notes, Criticism, Post-Colonial Texts, Journal of World Literature, Hawa, beautiful name, Journal of Women of the Middle East and the Islamic World, Comparative Literature Studies, and Film History. Right now, he's working on two book projects, one on world literature and the making of modern Turkey, and the other on the cultural and political history of film in the Arabian Peninsula. Before joining Georgetown, Qatar, he taught in the Comparative Literary Studies program of Northwestern University and the Departments of English and Comparative Literature at University of California, Los Angeles. I'm really looking forward to this talk. Thank you, Prathama Banerjee, for setting this up. Let's see what all is there. We are going to talk about cinema in the Gulf.
Thanks particularly to Pratma to open the space of the center for this talk that had to be put up in a relatively short notice. Of course, my dear colleague and friend Uday, to whom I already owe a lot. That's one more addition for your kind hospitality in my very first visit to India, to Delhi. And I can for sure say that I will make much more committed, show more committed effort to come more often and have more academic, intellectual conversations with the community here. So it has been for me an enormously beneficial, inspiring first introduction. And Uday, thanks again for facilitating that. Today, I would like to share my work of about 4 or 5 years of what initially began as interest in Gulf cinema, and anything Gulf quickly expands to the Indian Ocean. So in the last 2 years or so, I had more interest in thinking not only in terms of the more specific context of Gulf cinema, but in the Indian Ocean cinematic networks. And today, I would like to present what I have done so far, and it is not completely done yet. So it's still in work in progress, but I would like to present it in 2 parts. One is what I would like to call historicizing Indian Ocean cinematic networks. After I cover this part, I will move to a second part, which will be an attempt toward theorizing Indian Ocean cinematic network. So I will try to present my research in these 2 different modalities, and would be quite interested in your comments. So the first, on the first part, my initial focus is really thinking about cinema's arrival in the Gulf. And that was my first work in this project, trying to basically understand how early cinema culture of film experience took place in the Gulf. And as I was doing my research at the digital archives of the Qatar National Library, I find an archival document titled Bahrain Cinemas. Right. The next slide, please. And that archive basically starts with a letter from the British political agent or the colonial administrative law to the Bahrain's British government advisor, then to Charles Belgrave, in a letter that starts with this first sentence, right? A rumor that I hear in that letter says that I hear a rumor that an Arab is arranging to establish a cinema here. And in that letter, Locke says that, no, I don't think that's a good idea because experience elsewhere tells me that that the locals would not be ready for that. We don't want any sort of cultural trouble here, right? And immediately, where is that elsewhere is he referring to, right? And the moment I asked this question, I found myself in India on many levels, right? Next one, please. Like many of the colonial administrations of his time, Locke, before assigned to Bahrain, and 1932, let's remember that it is the year that oil was discovered in Bahrain, and as a result, that island becomes sort of the central British imperial interest in the Gulf. So, and it turns out that Locke had 5 different posts in India between 1919 and 1932, and this his time period coincides, as I later also find out, with the various discussions in India around this new medium called cinema, right? So I'll come to that in a moment. But then I realized that Belgrave, the government advisor to Bahrain, makes his first recruitment trip to Karachi. And during that time period, he visits the cinema houses in Karachi. As a matter of fact, he seems, for himself, he seems to be quite interested in the new medium, as long as, he keeps the locals away from it, as I will see in a moment. And in his diaries, we have that various notes about his trip in Karachi, and there he mentions 2 films. These are early, cinema films. One is titled Dante's Inferno. The other is The Private Life of Helen of Troy. And I think world literature people will quickly recognize that these were early movie adaptations of Western classics and so on. But of course, in a very popularized and vulgarized in certain forms, ways. And he's pretty much disturbed by that. He says, I don't know what an Indian audience would think of that kind of Western civilization, the representation of Western civilization. So there are all these Victorian moralistic arguments around that and so on. Of course, then you realize that this anxiety over the new media is pretty much spread across the colonial world, right? And over, like the account of Aldous Huxley in Java, but in many other places, European, particularly British intellectuals express various sort of anxieties over this new medium, especially in terms of the reception, right? And here Aldous Huxley, in his diary that takes place in Java, says, what were their private comments on this exhibition of Western civilization? I wondered. In North Africa, in India, I have also wondered, right? So it comes as a kind of, you know, that sort of almost epistemic suspicion. What are they thinking about that, what they see on the screen and so on. But quickly, it also becomes a political governmentality issue, so to speak. And as you may know, the British government in India establishes this cinematograph committee that does quite an extensive work, interviewing quite a number of people and so on, only to conclude that, you know, that there are sort of important differences in terms of how a European Western audience engages with this new medium and the colonized, right? And as a result, they basically recommend various forms of segregation of space, of film genres, and so on and so forth, right? And what is quite interesting when I, after all that, going back to the arrival of cinema in the Gulf, you realize that most of it is kind of reenacted, replayed in around the questions of having cinema in Bahrain, in the Gulf, and in the Gulf in general. And when we look at the Gulf in these early formative years, we basically have, we can talk about three spheres of moving image culture. And some of it happens in other parts of the world as well. So it's not just exception to the Gulf, but these spheres could be described as the sphere of private cinema, like private shows in let's say in the mansion, speaking of sarai, in the sarai of law, right? Or an admiral or the sheikh and so on and so forth. And these are like for exclusive audience, right? And after 1932, in 1935, as I will say in a moment, the oil company cinema gains its own sort of screening rights, again in an exclusive way for only the Euro-American expats, right? And in the midst of all that, there are these repeated attempts to establish a commercial public cinema. And in even looking at each of these spheres, in each one of them, you find quite interesting Indian Ocean connections once again, right? In terms of private cinema, the most prominent sort of practitioner of private cinema shows, and she has a collection of what we call late colonial amateur filmmaking. Eleanor Dial, Locke's wife, comes up in the archives quite prominently, and she has produced various cinefilms during her time in Bahrain. But quickly, I find out that she already starts this late imperial amateur filmmaking practice while she is in India, and the image on the left is titled Garden Party in Mysore residence. So basically, there is a continuation in terms of the formation of private cinema from India toward the Gulf, right? And we see a similar sort of linkage in the formation of the oil company cinemas as well. The oil company cinemas, as I said, they were exclusive to the staff members. And basically, it was their main kind of leisurely activity and so on. Now, as for the question of where do you get these films, right? And pretty much the oil company cinemas in Bahrain, later with Aramco and all of them, and Kuwait Oil Company and all that, they, a bit more, please. Next. And one more. Okay, thanks. They basically have to rely on the film distributors based in Karachi and Bombay, right? So most of the films that were screened in the oil companies would be shipped from the film distributors based in Karachi and Bombay. Of course, there are some interesting sort of details you come across in this in the archives. For instance, because of the very hot climate, most of this film, the celluloid film strips, come back as damaged. And the film distributors don't like it at all, and they start, you know, in their correspondence, they say that, you know, if that's going to happen, we are not going to send you our films anymore. And as a result, the oil company sort of asks for a special sort of flight priority with the British Imperial Airways, so that these films can circulate all the oil company clubhouses within 2 weeks. And then they would send them back and so on. So in other words, the film distributors, particularly in Karachi and Bombay, play a significant role in the formation of film culture, in this early formation of film culture in the Gulf. So these are some of the films that Charles Belgrave mentions in his diaries. So musical dramas, cartoons. Of course, by the 40s, more and more war films. By the way, they also rely a lot during the during the World War II period to the propaganda films made in India. So they would also bring some copies and show them in the Gulf for propaganda purposes as well. Okay, now probably the more interesting sort of Indian Ocean circuit that takes place at that time period is around the petitions for establishing a commercial public cinema. And all of them, I put all the petitions there. Sorry, yeah, go back, thanks. All the entrepreneurs who are petitioning to establish a public cinema, they come from India, right? And some already have experience in the new petro cities in Iran. But in Iran by 1930s, there is a higher sort of level of nationalism under the new Shah and so on. So they feel constrained. So they want to sort of now expand their operation to the Gulf, but also petitions from Bangalore, from Bombay, Karachi, and so on. And Belgrave and Locke, as the colonial kind of administrators, over and over sort of find their way to say no to these petitions, right? I don't have time to talk about these petition letters. They are quite interesting, especially in terms of, really articulating a certain theory of film, labor, and leisure. They make this argument over and over. They say that, now this, the emergent petro cities in the Gulf, you have all this influx of immigrant workers. You need to give them something, to sort of feel a bit entertained. You need to give them some leisurely venues, and what can it be better than a cinema and so on. But this argument doesn't, usually doesn't fly well with the colonial administrators. And next one. And only later, the first concession is granted to the nephews of the then Sheikh or Emir of Bahrain, right? So it becomes kind of an elite deal. But even so, in terms of establishing a censorship mechanism, even the electrical and other infrastructural regulations and so on, they don't have that. So they ask for the manual of the Bengal Board of Censors, which this is the more recent edition, but which was used since 1910s in India. And it's also yet another fascinating document. I think in terms of what can be censored, the one that sort of I always remember vividly is that no film that puts capital and labor at fights, at contention with one another, right? That's no, and so on. Here. So I'm not going to go to all the details, but the first film that is screened in that public cinema after these 10 sort of years long process of negotiation and so on is Vedat, an Egyptian film, one of the first films of the emergent Egyptian film industry. I don't know if you will recognize her. That's Kulthum, the Egyptian diva, her very first film, right? And there's an interesting moment there. The sort of one of the film songs in Vedat, in the Egyptian film Ala Baladil Mahbub, Take Me to the Country of My Beloved, later on finds its kind of Hindi, what do we call it, remake in Avara, in the song Gar Aya, sorry for my pronunciation, Gar Aya Mera Pardesi. And you see, there is a, you know, in the English translation, there is a conversation there. Here, my stranger returns home, take me to the country of my beloved. And so I find that quite a fascinating detail there. Okay. To move on now perhaps to the post-World War era, where things begin, you know, to flourish in terms of public cinemas. And even when you look at these older pictures in front of, you know, this is in Bahrain, the later cinemas that were established, you see Sangam as quite popular in that time period. Next, please. These are Kuwait cinemas. You have Chori Chori there in Al Firdaus, and the Dubai cinemas, as well as Qatar cinemas. Actually, I happened to visit it, and it is in the South Asian neighborhood in Doha, in Najmeh. These are some of the cinema posters from Dubai's Plaza. So once again, I think these films must be quite recognizable with Amitabh Bachchan and so on. Sangram again. Yeah, some, of course, the age of Kung Fu films as well. Mother India was quite popular, but also, yeah, Kamashastra in that mix. And to sort of extend the story from the Gulf, if you can go all the way to East Africa, and Laura Fair that Uday previously had mentioned has done brilliant work in terms of showing sort of the huge popular appeal of Hindi films, not only in the Gulf but all the way in East Africa, along the coast of East Africa, in Tanzania, Zanzibar, and so on. And one more, please. So these are all posters from that time period. So this is in terms of concluding that first part. When you look at that history in the history of film circulation in the Indian Ocean, it is quite clear that from the early 20th century, it was Bollywood, or as it used, you know, Bollywood is a later term, Hindi's films, rather than Hollywood, that was in demand, right? From the 1950s through the 1980s, one of their greatest sources of global returns was the poor East African country of Tanzania. And Hollywood's global market share, measured in terms of screen time, had almost no relation whatsoever to the social, cultural, and intellectual impact of films. Intellectual impact of the Hindi films on different regions of the globe. And you know, I don't, again, I have much time to go into details, but in a way, these films were really great sort of sources of post-colonial socialist romance visions, right? You find it over and over as it is being played out. But maybe we can talk about that later. Now, to move to my second part, and this is an attempt at theorizing how can we attempt at theorizing Indian Ocean cinematic networks. And I have been working around a couple of terms, a couple of concepts in order to think film with the Indian Ocean. I think this thinking with the Indian Ocean, the term belongs to my dear colleague Uday. I think in many different occasions would say, let's think with the Indian Ocean. So that's my attempt to think film with the Indian Ocean around the notion of the archipelagic, the littoral, the mobile and the circular, the archival and its affects, and some think sort of in terms of capturing this affect, what I would like to call archipelagy. So a kind of play on archipelago and elegy, try to think these two terms together. So in terms of the archipelagic lens, that for me defines a representational mode of capturing, perhaps, the continuum of communities that are ecologically, structurally, and culturally shaped by the sea. And for me, a good illustration of that comes from a novelist, Abdurrazak Gurna. And when we had I think we had a webinar with him, and during that webinar, he said the following, right? From as early as I could remember as a child, there are late months of the year from around November, December or so. So he's talking from Zanzibar, right? So the arrival of dozens of ships of all sizes from different parts of the Indian Ocean. They would be from the Arabian Peninsula, from the Gulf, from India, and occasionally even further away, the huge ships that sometimes came from as far away as Thailand. And the sailors and the traders on these ships sprawled themselves and their wares among us, beside us, everywhere. It was impossible not to know that you were part of a wider world with its own center of gravity, a cosmopolitan world, if you like, and that we were networked in a shared cultural and historical community. I thought, I always found this passage a great way of expressing what we might call an archipelagic being in the world, sense of being in the world, right? And what I'm trying to see, or what I have been really observing, is that the canon of Indian Ocean films come with this with a strong sense of the archipelagic, right? And in a way, it reflects a certain world expanding vision that takes formal shape in creative works by crafting narrative portals that open to other stories, other worlds, and so on. Now, as for the second concept, the littoral form, here I'm in conversation with Michael Pearson's kind of canonical essay in the Indian Ocean Studies, the littoral society. And some of you will quickly recognize, will quickly recognize this passage from the essay where Pearson says, there is such a thing as littoral society. We can go around the shores of an ocean or a sea, or indeed the whole world, and identify societies that have more in common with other littoral societies than they do with their inland neighbors. Surat and Mombasa have more in common with each other than they do with inland cities such as Nairobi or Ahmedabad. Right? Of course, there have been various nuanced invitation to think in more nuanced forms about Pearson's essay and so on. But for me, it enabled me to think about the notion of the littoral form. So, the premise that, or the hypothesis that if littoral societies indeed share a common history, heritage, and material culture across its otherwise diverse shores, then the littoral must generate a certain cinematic ecology, a certain cinematic idiom, right, that encompasses a transnational film culture across the Indian Ocean. And as I have some examples to share later, but as a result of that, we will have in Indian Ocean film season starting in June in collaboration with the Africa Institute in Sharjah, but I'll keep you posted for that. So the littoral form of invokes a certain amphibian aesthetics that is characterized, right, by the perspectival ambivalence and optical bifocality that arises from the littoral, in which the sensory perception is oriented simultaneously towards land and sea, interior and exterior, here and there, right? And in many of the examples that I have seen, not only in the early examples of local Gulf cinema, but across the Indian Ocean littoral, you find that optical bifocality to be kind of the pattern, right? Then I have thought a bit together with yet another canonical essay, that's cultural anthropologist Enseng Ho's essay on mobile concepts, inter-Asian concepts for mobile societies, right? And as you may recall, in that essay, Enseng Ho, one of his arguments is that those smaller, mobile, less integrative societies of the Indian Ocean, right, have become difficult to see because the notion of society that has been created by Enlightenment theory focuses on the internal constitution of large encompassing aggregates. Sometimes we call them empire, sometimes nation state, right? And such aggregates banish the external and the outside to a realm beyond the pale, outside of the core understanding of society, right? So if that's the case, then from a cinematic perspective, how can we think about the moving image vis-a-vis in moving societies or mobile societies, right? I think that becomes quite an important question in thinking about Indian Ocean cinema as such, right? And in a way, like Enseng Ho tries to do, is a kind of new social science model. As film scholars, probably one thing we could look into is what we might call visual disaggregation and reaggregation, right? And I almost rewrite Enseng Ho from a film studies perspective, saying that the dominance of aggregate notions of film, their rigidification in association with nations and states, and the theoretical investments that fills them up with structural content and defines what they are, have created blinders that make it difficult for us to see the range and reach of mobile small societies of the sort that crisscross the image world of the Indian Ocean. Right? And I also think that this could be particularly relevant in thinking about the archive, the visual archive of the Indian Ocean. And in addition to Enseng Ho, I sort of established conversation with two other sort of companions. One is Saadia Hartman's, one of the most brilliant critical theorists, I think, of our contemporary period, and around her notion of critical fabulation, which she defines as a reading of the archive that mimes the figurative dimensions of history to imagine what might have happened or might have been said or might have been done, and to make visible the production of disposable lives, right? I'll come to that in a moment. As a great Tarkovsky fan, I believe that his notion of sculpting in time or thinking about the film medium can be productive, theoretical perspective in thinking about the archives of the moving image of the Indian Ocean. And Tarkovsky's notion of sculpting in time, as he defines it, is that the primary material with which the filmmaker works is blocks of time imprinted onto strips of celluloid. The filmmaker captures, shapes them, and releases them in the act of projection. And if you are familiar with Tarkovsky's mirror, he does that with various raw footage, documentary footage from the Spanish Civil War, from World War II era, and so on. And he basically animates, activates the archive, making it, giving it a certain narrative agency rather than just a photographic documentary thing out there, right? And this is this is one of the sort of quite strong for me moments in what he does with the Spanish Civil War kind of victims that have to leave their homes and so on. And through this documentary footage, he captures the fear and the confusion of this displaced child, right? And sometimes going back to the Eleanor Dial collection, that the films that she did in Bahrain, I think that Tarkovskian notion could be could be quite useful. These are emancipated slaves looking at us, right? And here another screenshot. So I realized that I need to develop this better, but that's all I'm trying to say is that some ways of thinking about what to do, how to move the archives of the Indian Ocean world, I think is important. And finally, on the notion of archipelagy, that's sort of emerged as a result of my work on the more recent films produced from different parts of the Indian Ocean littoral. And I think the pattern, what I've been so far seeing is an affective visual quest for the hoped for, the denied, the lost, and the retrieved in fragments. So they come with, these films come with that strong sense of what I call archipelagy, sometimes expressed in the form of insularity, sometimes ecological laws, sometimes in the form of trauma and violation, of course, the encroachment of capitalism, tourism, development, gentrification, and so on, is pretty much the theme of these films. And so these are some among my long list of what I call archipelagic. I need to find a better word to say that, but elegiac films, right? From the Gulf, but also from the Indian Ocean islands, Madagascar, Mauritius, Comoros, and so on. Okay, how are we doing in terms of? I think, yeah, I won't have
clip.
time to have.
I think you can. You should.
I don't. We didn't set it up.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll send them later. Very quickly. On this final theme of circularity and its cinematic afterlives. And that's also in conversation with Enseng Ho's essay, where he says circulations of peoples across the transregional axis that straddle the Indian Ocean are thick and historically continuous. In the early 20th century period of colonialism, one-way migration swamped these circulations, but today the circulations are back as migrant workers are denied long-term or permanent residence and have to return home, right? And for me, the most brilliant cinematic expression of that is the camps project from Gulf to Gulf to Gulf. I don't know if some of you have seen it, but yeah. And, you know, in terms of thinking about circularity as lived experience, that's probably one of the most brilliant example. And it does a number of things, right? It's a reconstruction of affects rather than just an ethnographic analysis. The fascinating superimposition of raw cell phone videos recorded by the sailors onto Sufi devotional chants and popular Hindi film songs is great moments of what I would like to call contrapuntal lyricism, right? And pretty much freed from being pleased by the directorial gaze, and really an act of documenting without shifting focus to a native informant voice favored by Western film festivals and funders. And if you recall, the last sort of the credits scene of this film is really in conversation with Enseng Ho's notion of the view from the boat, and from the Gulf to Gulf to Gulf, the protagonists are the dhows, right? They are all recognized as the as the actors of that film as such, El Sultan, El Mihrab, and so on and so forth, right? And there are, really brilliant moments in this film, and quite a conscious sort of, not really conscious, but a very remarkable sort of example of how filming wandering life would be, and one of the sort of sailor film directors basically enacts that in a very sort of miniature style, and with that one, Pagla Avara, with Avara, yeah. Okay, and one last thing, yeah, these are, maybe I'll, and in a way, from Gulf to Gulf to Gulf is a great example of the enduring contemporaneity of what Abdul Sharif and other Indian Ocean scholars have called the Dow cultures, the Indian Ocean connections, cultural, economic, human connections that have been taking place for so long. Okay, thank you so much, and thank you for your patience for listening to me. Wow.
Thank you, Firas. It is a large project, and thanks for introducing it to us.
So it was kind of a montage, a collage of what I have been doing.
Right, clearly. No, I mean, I enjoyed it. Camp film was shown here actually as part of a larger event, in which we had seminars as well as these documentaries also. So this film we have seen just as you go out in the open space on your right. It was shown there, I think, during the, in a black box and in a black room. Okay, so thanks a lot for also for reminding me of a very powerful visuals from that film. It does talk very powerfully about the migrant cultures and the things, that artifacts that people carry, the stories that they carry, and the music that they carry. So yeah, I mean, thanks a lot. There is a larger kind of story here. It's also about the absent archive. Some of these films are not available. Some of those contexts are not available except on the paper, right? As Devshri Mukherjee pointed out long time back, that we have to write a different kind of history of a cinematic culture because the films themselves are not there. But it's also so different. The Bombay, Karachi, and the continuities between, even though there's a split, there's a partition between India and Pakistan, the continuities are very interesting, and a lot of scholars are trying to find out what those continuities are. Did this culture as a habit of producing cinema and of watching cinema, did it change all of a sudden? Does Lahore become really different from, from Bombay? So no, but thanks for, pointing out a particular kind of trajectory of cultural experience, which is long embedded. Others have talked about Kerala and the oceanic experience there.
Yes.
Dilip Menon, I was reminded of his work, and
Bindu Menon as well.
Bindu Menon as well, right? So thanks a lot. There's a lot of resonance. I will come back to a couple of very specific questions that I'm curious about. Whether there's not a resonance of special resonance with Islamic aid films, for example, in the Gulf. Is it in the sense that the category is available from the 1930s onwards in India of Islamic aid films? So they must be seen as a special attraction. what kind of documentation do we have? What kind of anxiety do we have in the colonial official circles who are learning so much from India, as you rightly pointed out? So that's one. And the other is, I mean, this is to extend the missing archive question. Cinema, a lot of people, including some of us here, are working on cinema through other media forms, that you can't have an island called cinema without imagining a larger ecology of other media that relay, carry, and comment, as well as fracture cinema, in the sense that cinema can be carried as an oral medium through radio. You are talking about gramophone in your early part of the article that is published. So there's a larger ecology that gets built. So does that matter? In the camp film, all of it comes together. All of that media does come together, but including the cell phone. But that's recent, right? That's a product of globalization. How does one write a similar history historically of the moment that you are trying to invoke, when sound was actually emerging and there was so much excitement about it? Then does it? So I mean, of course, you don't have to do our kind of history. There is a different and very attractive and wonderful kind of history that is emerging here. But this is just to set up a conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I can try this initial two questions, and then I'd be interested to have more questions from you as well. Thanks, Ravikant. These are really very generative two questions about the presence of what you described as Islamicate film culture. I can answer that through a number of moments, right? I would say that it finds its sort of appearance perhaps at a later stage in the 70s and sort of 80s and so on. That's one particular moment. Clearly, when you look at the sort of the newspapers and sort of various announcements about films and so on, in the Gulf, the messenger, Mustafa Akas's The Messenger, really has this. Of course, it happens across many other parts of the Muslim world, but it does capture a certain sort of Islamicate film experience, sort of, day after day, people flocking into the cinemas to see this film, right? Maybe this is a bit detailed, but in the more perhaps long-term thing that happens again in the 80s in the Gulf is, and that coincides with the sort of increasing conservative religious trend in the region, and with the sort of introduction of the VHS tapes, the video, right? We have a shift there towards some articulation of Islamicate film around the notion of cinema nazife, which means clean cinema. And these are films that are basically produced and imported particularly for the Gulf audience, the Arabian Peninsula audience, from Egypt, right? And so they have, in certain ways, various Islamicate themes and so on, right? But in the earlier moments, one detail that I could share to that effect is that, especially in Bahrain, the cinema halls are used for various A, nationalist, B, religious congregations, right? And the British colonial sort of officers keep an eye on that, right? What are they doing and so on. So the cinema space being used by the young nationalist as a gathering space. It's not exactly Islamicate as such, but you find that also Yaman there. Other media ecologies. That's a great question. I'll have to look into it a bit more carefully. I mean, maybe the easier answer is that
musical cultures that emerge around cinema, offshoot of cinema. Like, I mean, radio, we cannot imagine without cinema in South Asia.
Yeah.
And also, radio has a presence also in the Gulf. So I was wondering what the characters like Amin Sayani, whether they were, there is a larger ecology or not.
Yeah, I think with radio, I think the conversation is more with the dramatic drama or theatrical forms, right? The masrah, so it would be more theater, radio theaters. By the way, they still have them on Qatar's radio, and each time I ask my students, I happen to be the only one who listens to these radio theaters. They are still active. Yeah, that I understand. So the conversation happens, but I think in terms of sound in the Gulf, as you know, in the larger Indian Ocean world, the sheer attraction to musicals, right, is I think could be looked into more carefully in terms of that media convergence, right? Pretty much most of these films are sort of, they are musical performances, right? And they have huge attractions.
Thanks. Yes, Dhananjay. Let's start with Dhananjay.
Two queries. One is, I mean, the nature of the state in Bahrain and India and the cinematic relation. Do you see the difference of, I mean, India was directly a colonial state and the Bahrain was a protectorate of British Empire. So did you see some impact of the nature of regime on cinema exchange between these two realms? And second, can we also explore the relationship between, I mean, for example, the exposure to Indian artifact was a Western world. I mean, the initial films were inspired and lots of religious, hagiographic, and many films were censored. I mean, any allusion to Mahatma or Gandhi and Bapu or kind of figure were banned. So what kind of impact did you see in Bahrain, even in terms of oceanic network circle or film circuit, which you proposed?
Mm-hmm. I think what I find is that in terms of the films that are screened in the commercial public cinemas, perhaps one can say that that there is a heightened sort of precaution in terms of you know, certain stories, certain image depictions, and so on and so forth, and in a way, sort of censorship would take place before even sort of reaching the audience, and the audience would react to it, and then they will retreat and so on and so forth. So I think the sensitivities were a bit sort of stronger in the Gulf. Now, obviously, I think I take your first question as a question of scale. That's maybe for me what it suggests, right? Bahrain is, quite really a tiny island, 25 miles to 25 miles or something like that. Similarly, right, most of these Gulf coastal city-states, right, they are small in size. I mean, and not only sort of the physical smallness, but in a way, for a very long time period, you basically have 1, 2, at best 3, 4 sort of cinema venues, public cinema venues, whereas in India the scale is beyond comparison, right? And from that perspective, at least on the basis of the readings I have done so far on the history of cinema in South Asia, it poses very, quite a different set of issues for anyone who attempts to control the medium, right? Or even to benefit from the medium and so on and so forth, right? So you have that difference of scale. I don't know if it would be related exactly to your question, but gradually, especially from the 70s onwards, definitely from the 80s, 90s onwards, what I observe in across the Gulf is kind of the relegation of these early cinema culture, cinema spaces, and so on, to the migrant parts, to the migrant zones of this of the cities, right? It becomes almost part of migrant culture and so on. And even now, in the age of sort of Gulf gentrification and so on, I have, all these projects, curated projects about this history of film culture is very much connected to the history of migrant labor in these places. So that's also, I think, an interesting afterlife of that.
Prathama.
I learned a lot and also really enjoyed it. So just a couple of thoughts, not really questions, just because I'm an outsider to both oceanic studies and cinema studies. So some of the questions might sound a little counterintuitive, but forgive me for that. It's just a kind of to think with. So one thought that struck me was that there are two stories that you are telling us. One is a story about people, and the other is a story about cinema, right? And my feeling is that from the first part of your presentation to the last, the register of the story shifted from that of a circulation of technology and medium and infrastructure to a story of littoral societies and people's lives on oceanic routes. I was wondering if this tension itself can be a generative thing to think with, in a sense that can it be said at a larger theoretical level that the story of the movement of medium and technology is never fully coincidental to the story of the movement of peoples and cultures. And in other words, can one even ask the kind of counter question, is it possible to have a cinematic culture with which there is no necessarily organic identification? Right. You know, so that's the kind of thought that comes to my mind when I listen to this presentation, because at another level, so your argument that Bollywood cinema, and empirically, it's absolutely correct. And we, you know, you demonstrated it so beautifully. Bollywood cinema has had much more of an impact in the entire Indian Ocean area than has Hollywood. But what if the story is retold from perspective of, let us say, the story of infrastructures, the story of cinematic technique, the story of, the hardware or the material, and that the movement of celluloid, let's say, where does celluloid get imported from? What happens to its celluloid? Now, if we think of that story, will that story be different from the story of, you know, a cultural network across the ocean? So that's something that may be worth thinking about. The second thing that I mean, this is again only a thought, because when you mentioned Gurna, I was, and his presentation, I was remembering his Paradise, right? And the novel, the fascinating story of, and this pertains to your story about the, which I really loved, amphibian aesthetic of the bifocal optic. The Paradise story, the protagonists are merchant communities, right? And the Paradise story is about merchant lives that literally mediate between the coast and the highlands and the barbaric areas inland, and the story of the difficulty of that mediation and the story of the difficulty of that translation, in which, of course, the meta-narrative is of commerce, right? So I was wondering if the story of commerce can be absent from a story of a cinematic Indian Ocean. But the moment we talk about commerce, the story of migrant lives, loss, memory, invisibility might have to be retold from a different kind of perspective. So just, yeah.
Quite brilliant comments and questions. Thank you. Well, on the first one, you are absolutely right. And in a way, I'm sometimes debating if actually this should be two separate book projects, and maybe that could be the solution. I think you are right. Maybe in a more and apologies for butchering your brilliant way of putting the tension. In a way, it's a question, I think, of two different, looking at two different things, right? One, in the first one, in the first part is really an exploration of the history of cinema culture, right? And very much more sort of centered on those who quote unquote consume that, experience that, the audience, and so on and so forth, right? And then the other dimension maybe I've been trying to sort of see if the two could be done together, but the other dimension is pretty much centered on the questions of, as you said, technique, form, the medium itself, right, and representation. I think the question of representation. So there is a mismatch certainly there, and you know. The second dimension, of course, brings us to the 40s and so on. It is, and even with the, you know, however exciting and beautiful they were, it is basically consuming Bollywood and, you know, Egyptian films and so on. When it comes to production, then things change, right? First of all, we talk about maybe at least 50 years of lapse, right? Wherever you look, and even now, you know, they are very much in terms of production, they have to either rely on state funding, or they are, or you know, festival funds for in order to make these projects possible and so on. So yeah, there is definitely, yeah, I agree, these two modalities happening, and yeah, when sort of the cinematic lens shifts toward commerce, what happens to affects, right? That's a great question. The problem is that, at least in terms of what has been produced so far, it's almost like there is a set language that, you know, there is almost, I don't want to say refusal, but in a way, film almost cannot think its relationship with commerce, capital, and so on and so forth in some kind of negative way, right? I mean, even with the first Gulf film, Basya Bahar, The Cruel Sea, and so on, that's pretty much an attack on pearl trade. It's just a clear attack, right? That, you know, it has brought nothing to us but misery and hardship and so on and so forth. Right? I don't know if that answers your question, but there's almost like the film form itself doesn't perhaps know how to do it differently, but there
are a couple of questions online. So Ravi, you want to come in? Ravi Vasudevan?
Yeah, okay, fine. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you for the really ambitious outline of your project, which seems to really be made up of a number of different possibilities, as far as I could make out. And I look very much forward to, especially your kind of mapping of the kind of the literal affect in cinema, and how you could actually kind of do a curation, or kind of, you know, orchestrate a series of kind of instances where this can be productively mapped. I was thinking concretely from the point of view of film history, how to think some of the issues which you posed, and I found it very instructive that across British administered colonial territories, we had this emergence of a kind of template. So that, I think, is of interest, because it's a kind of administrative template, which from 1918 onwards, when the colonial government instituted a series of ways of monitoring and regulating cinema exhibition, that seems to be a reference point for other territories, for example, with Bahrain, as what you described. So that itself is worth, I think, pursuing at one level. The other thing is to actually how best one can track the logic of distribution, because you've already indicated, the ways in which Karachi and Bombay become important kind of vectors. So to actually be able to track the key distributors who are involved in actually kind of moving cinematic product would be of interest. Certainly the trade magazines. Now, I'm sure they would be available to you as well. And I noticed that you have used the British Library India Office collections for this. But trade magazines periodically emerge within actual kind of policy documents as well. But more generally, even to actually look at, for example, Indian trade magazines may be apposite, for your project. So Film India, for example, which is well known, it's online, it's easily available from 1935 onwards, also kind of periodically indicates key kind of distribution spaces and players, especially in the Gulf, Iran and Iraq, as kind of, so that may be, and they're tracking the fate of these institutions and distribution. So that will be one interesting kind of area for you to look at. Now, Bahrain seems to be quite distinct, as opposed to this wider circulation, Iran, Iraq, India, simply because of this kind of strict control that Aramco exercised in the area. And so there's some distinction there, it may represent the overall portrait, although from what you say from the late 30s onwards, it starts kind of falling into place in terms of accessing commercial film networks. So that seems to be already become part of a wider ground. But the film trade magazine would be, I think, an appropriate thing. The other thing is this. This is something which actually Ravikant has assembled for us, which is the censor board certification process. Because the censor board actually facilitates an intricate mapping from year to year, month to month, as to what films are actually being exhibited or released. Now, this is available for India, but that will give you an index, of exactly the variety and language of films from which places, because they will, in Indian case, we are actually getting that kind of detail from the First World War onwards. So, this will give you.
Once we can't hear you. You want to switch off your camera, Ravi? We can't hear you.
Sorry, but the screen got frozen for me.
Yeah. So we could not hear the last part.
That was about actually tracking
After censorship,
distribution. So censorship certificates are one key thing. I don't know what availability there is in the various, like Bahrain and other spaces. I noticed that, say, Brigitte Rernwald, whom I'm sure you're familiar with, has actually been mapping this for Zanzibar, for example, and shows the connections between Bombay and Karachi distribution and the emergence of cinema in Zanzibar with some detail. So that's, there are actual kind of different spaces. Your thing is actually they're multi-sited in one layer. The logic of one of your research is kind of multi-sited, seeing the tracking from different points. So this is one logic I was thinking of. Secondly, music, something which Ravikant and you have both mentioned. But what is the physicality? I think that's what Fatma says. What is circulation here? What is the physicality of the movement of music across spaces in terms of the gramophone records and companies who are involved in actually kind of transiting this material in the earlier period? We know, for example, there's a really interesting work on Greece and the impact of Bombay film music on Greece and the adaptation of Bombay film music primarily from the 50s. And we know the East European market is another very important segment, which how it's orchestrated. So just as we would have the Gulf, the Indian Ocean as one kind of circulatory order in which media material is moving. Basically, media material is moving. You know, as what Prathama says, celluloid. Its actual movement is quite consequential. And it's not necessarily just the literal areas. We have work on Bengal showing that the Aurora Film Company actually also kind of markets in East Africa. So we're actually traversing spaces as well, you know. So East Africa becomes an important moment in all of this. So there are a number of interesting dimensions in terms of film historical research, as of a multi-sited sort, with various types of material centered on distribution, both of cinema and of music, and of documentation about the emergence and into exhibition through various documentary tracks or regulatory logics as well, which actually provide you with this possibility. But the film trade magazine is often extremely important in all this. But as I said, apart from all that, I'm very much looking forward to your literal imaginary and how that's actually mapped in the cinema. I mean, I'm a great Tarkovsky kind of fan as well. So it'll be interesting to see what you actually, how you bring Bollywood and Tarkovsky together in this project.
Thank you, Ravi. These are really very helpful comments. And I think this will be one particular reason when the recording is shared with me, I'll make a note of all the suggestions you made, the sources and so on, and look into them. Of course, that also all your set of rich comments shows me once again that I think for this project I need to spend more extended time in India. So center had fellowships last time I heard.
Yeah. There's one question online. Ayodhya, let's have a look. Yeah, thanks for your paper. It was very enjoyable for me, Ashwarj says. However, when you discuss the spread of Hindi cinema in East Africa, it needed to be clarified which section of the society was watching these films. Also, if you throw light on whether most people who watched these films were local people or Indian
Mix.
expatriates who were taken to East Africa for labor work. Because Hindi was spoken in East Africa, Indian immigrants had a big role in the and demand for cinema. So possibly some new dimensions of analysis will also be added.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Thank you. But I think, and there could be a certain value in thinking sort of analytically sort of separate the local, however we define that, audience in the Gulf or in Zanzibar and so on, and the foreign workers, expatriates and so on. I think, yeah, there could be a certain value in looking into that, but pretty much, and this is where you get some sort of, I don't know if solidarity could be too big a word there, but a certain coming together, right? A convergence of, yeah, local audience and foreign labor audience in that space. And, you know, pretty much after World War II, even the sort of the colonial administrators and so on, they codify it as such, and sort of they sort of sort of attribute Bollywood films in particular as the type of film culture that them are outside, but the rest is sort of all mixed together, right? So I think rather than the differences, probably to think about how these films brought, especially non-Western audiences together can also be a useful perspective to look at.
Right. Thanks, Firat, and thanks all of you for coming and asking those very interesting questions. So I think we should stop now.
Sure.
And
so
we would have another session at another time in future, right?
Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah. Longer
thanks.
conversation, right?
That was great.